Hello class. This week I want to introduce the second unit of the course, which is drawing environments, both interior and exterior. And so I want to start this week's video by sharing with you some contemporary artists whose subject matter deals with spaces. And so let's start with that. The first artist I want to talk to you about today is Katharine Murphy. Katharine Murphy was a professor at Yale where I went to graduate school, and she's known for these extremely detailed paintings of spaces usually. And she always works from life. And so when working outside, sometimes these paintings that take place outside take her over 10 years to complete because there's only a period of a couple weeks each year where the light conditions are the same that she's working with. This is one of her interiors. And if you ever get a chance to hear Katharine Murphy talk about her work, she talks about the power of these moments that she observes, that these images act as sort of catalysts or metaphors for other things that are going on in her life. These are really devotional images. She comes from a strong Christian faith background, and there's this devotional aspect to the paintings that is present. Apparently, this hair floated in the sink for quite a long time while this painting was being made. This is another exterior, and Katharine Murphy's work is sometimes almost hyper-real, where every single aspect of the image is really rendered. Something that you should see with Katharine Murphy's work, she's not really emphasizing shadows, but she's still able to maintain a strong believability of form. And she does a lot of close-ups. And so that's why I wanted to start this slideshow with her work, because for all of you starting with drawing environments, it's going to be smarter to lean into what you learned from the unit on objects and still lives and go for views that are a little more close up. It just gives you more room for detail. The next artist I have here is Cindy Towers. She's another contemporary painter, and she has a series of work where she went to abandoned factories. And so she made these really chaotic paintings of these broken down spaces. So the next artist I want to cover is David Hockney. David Hockney represents an artist that is using a more stylized strategy to depict environments. And so when I use the word stylization, it means the artist is choosing to break from representing something like it is in the real world. So here, Hockney has simplified detail and has presented this pool and building in a really graphic way. And this is one of his best known paintings. Here you can see there's also marks. The mark making on the window denotes the sheen, the shine. The marks on the water are representing the ripples. So it's also a really stylized use of marks. The next artist is a contemporary of mine, Doron Langberg. We went to graduate school together, and I wanted to put these paintings in because Doron will project his compositions, and then he gets very loose with the textures. And so the tight line work of the environment really wrangles in and reins in some really textured and chaotic uses of the material. This is another painting of his. And so they're environments that are pushed really to the edge of representation. They're almost more like abstract compositions, but you can make out the space of the environment and the figures. This is a painting by Hopper, another contemporary painter of environments. And what I want to point out here is that there's different strategies going on. All of the space in the interior of this painting looks more realistic, and everything on the outside is a little more graphic and stylized and simplified. And it's a good idea to always handle the different spaces of your environmental works with different strategies, at least different values or different textures. Another Hopper. You can see the light situation on the outside is very different than the inside. Next is the work by contemporary artist Njideka Crosby. And I wanted to show you her work because she does some really dynamic things with image transfers and collages. So you have these drawn and painted environments, and then they're actually composed of lots of tiny images. So all inside the figures and the spaces are collaged many images. Her work is deeply personal and talks about her background and what it is like to kind of be a citizen of two countries and multiple cultures. So you can see here that the transfers in the floor, the images that make it up. And because there's enough sort of compositional arrangement of these really busy images, it doesn't overwhelm the picture because you have these negative space areas that help balance the image. If everything was the transfers, it might be too visually chaotic to have impact. And then I have the work of a contemporary and a friend of mine, Tom Betthauser. He makes these environments where he imagines these rooms when he's in them, what they would look like from a three-quarter view. So he's using imagination and observation to render these really tiny paintings of spaces. So these are real spaces. And so it's a combination of imagination and observation, and they remind me of video game formats of where your vantage point is in a video game. All right, so those are just some examples of different contemporary artists that depict environments as the content of their work. And that leads me to your exercises for the week. And so for your exercises for the week, you are to spend 2 to 2.5 hours completing a full page interior space drawing. So I wanted to give you guys some examples of what might be good places to draw around where you are and why. And so I'm going to cover some of the test shots that I've taken to give you guys some guidance for this week. So first I want to cover some of the test shots that I took of interior spaces, what might make them a good choice. And so I'm going to go over some guidelines that might be useful to follow. So as I mentioned earlier, you are probably going to want to do somewhat of a close-up for these drawings. 2.5 hours is not that much time to complete a convincing drawing of a space. But if you zoom in quite a bit, you're more likely to be able to finish it and create convincing spaces. And so this first shot I have taken is just in the bathroom. And what I was looking for was really clear forms and very different values. And so I was interested in the tiles being in shadow against the tub being hit with highlight and some of the chipped paint and that really dark shadow at that corner. So you really want to get into the habit of imagining what your subject is going to be like to draw. That you now know how time-consuming drawing can be, so you want to be really discerning and take time to plan, draw thumbnail sketches. Taking a photo of your vantage point is a really reliable way to see if the composition is going to work, but you can also just take your fingers and make a rectangular shape as a viewfinder and look through at different spots to try to see what might make a strong composition as well. So this is another shot that I took as a test shot. It's just on a little windowsill, and I wanted to focus on some simpler forms in the pot for the plant and just show a little bit of those leaves because, again, if I chose a vantage point with all of the leaves of this plant, I would have to sit there and draw all of the leaves. And I decided I was more interested in the more simple form of the pot than the plant itself. And I was interested in the shadow as well and some of the spaces around. So it's important that the vantage point that you pick includes some of the actual space of the building, even if it's just a little bit of it, because if you just focus on an object, this is just a still life drawing. So you really want to show me in these drawings sort of how the actual space is in your vantage point. So this is another example This is another fairly close-up viewpoint. This could be used as either the interior space or the homework if you wanted to choose to do it for an interior and exterior, because we're seeing outside the window as well as the stones inside. And I chose this vantage point because, again, you're going to have to draw everything in the view, and the way the light was hitting those rocks seemed like that would be fun to draw. It would provide a nice contrast to the edging of the window, which I would definitely be using a ruler, painter's tape, to get those straight lines, and then to imply all that stuff outside the window seems okay, and that's all happening at lighter values. So that's why I chose this vantage point. And then I have some caribou antlers in a corner in one of my rooms that I noticed the shadows were quite great. I actually walked around with a lamp to take these test shots, and you all should be editing and curating these spaces. You don't have to just go with how these spaces are when you find them. You can curate it. And so I brought a lamp over to create these interesting shadows, and I like the contrast of textures and maybe the outlet. I think the outlet to me is a lot less interesting than drawing the antlers against that stucco wall. So I might be discerning and retake a shot without the outlet there. But the outlet does provide some contrast, so this would be a decent vantage point. And I want you to look at how I've composed the image. The antlers hit the edges of my page in a way that lets the viewer's eye move throughout the whole piece. There's no area that's kind of dead space here. And then the last interior shot I took was of the torn garbage bag that's at my drawing setup for this class. And I just liked how the light was hitting the stretched garbage bag. I liked the frayed edge against the straight linear architecture of the wall. And then there's just enough deep space on the right side of the image to suggest the rest of this environment. And I like that it wouldn't take that long to suggest that over there. So all of these are manageable within 2.5 hours. And that's also why I chose these close-ups. So next I went outside and I took some exteriors for examples for your exercise 2. And just for reference, I've uploaded these images into the week folder so you can look at them for a guide. And it's a good idea to think about and set up a clear foreground, middle ground, and background for your image. So here, this pumpkin is obviously the foreground, the planter behind it or the tree is the midground, and then those trees in the background and the road are the far background. And it's smart to do that because since you want to create a believable space, if these forms are just obviously in deep space, possibly even overlapping each other, it sets you up to create that illusion. So this is another spot that I chose. I probably wouldn't go with this one just because it's not that interesting to me. But I chose it because there's this dark void over here and the light is creating some different shades. And there's some interesting texture on the wood as it's eroding. And then there's some contrast with the stone. But this was one of the least interesting ones that I've chosen. I chose this one because I thought the darks happening at that sunken floorboard would be interesting to draw. So this one would be okay. But keep in mind, you know, you have to draw everything in the view, and the light situation for the dying plants in that little planter, they're not that crisp or clear in the photo, which means they're going to be even more ambiguous in the drawing. And that's something you guys should always watch out for. If something's confusing looking or the form is not that pronounced, or it's confusing, you know, in the reference, it's going to be even more confusing or unclear in the drawing once it's translated again. So it's just, be careful. So I would also not choose this one probably. This one I took at a hose because I like the light situation on these cylinders, the contrast of the hose texture to the wall. This one's pretty interesting. I might go for this one if I had to do exercise 2 and pick an exterior. And I chose this one. It got a lot of strong, deep, dark values underneath this deck. And that's also something I want you all to pay attention to. You should be looking for shadows and looking for strong value differences between your subjects within the viewpoint. So the rock is not lit with clear highlights and shadows, so I probably wouldn't pick this one. And then I wanted to show you 2 examples of really bad views to pick for this exercise. So this may be the first thing you think of when you think of environment. So this was just a shot I took that's really far away, but I just want to point out why this is a really bad idea for the exercise. So number one, there are no obvious shadows really. And shadows are the easiest way to communicate form and space in a drawing. So if you can't see them, it's going to be next to impossible to communicate them in the drawing. And I don't want you inventing information that's not there. So that's the number one reason. Number two is everything's so far away in this view that really nothing could be rendered with any detail, nothing at all in this. The leaves would need to be implied and just suggested with the texture. The grass would need to be suggested with a different texture. And as I'm looking at the grass even, there's very little variation of light and shadow or any sort of difference anywhere on this. And so that would also probably fall flat on the drawing as well. So be careful about zooming out too much. It can be too time consuming and or impossible to kind of render these forms well if the light isn't strong and if you don't have enough time. So be careful. And then likewise, I took an interior shot that would similarly not be a good choice for the exercises this week. For 2.5 hours, it's just simply not enough time to render everything like this. And second, all the forms like the chairs and the table will be so small in the drawing that there's going to be very little room to cultivate any sort of detail or believable form. And so this is also poor choice for the amount of time you have and for what's doable on that sheet of paper. So that is what I want to cover for the week, just to give you some examples of different vantage points that you can select for your interior drawing for your exercise this week, different vantage points that might be good choices for the exterior